Good morning, and welcome to the second of two videos on um, genetic inheritance. Now, in this video, what we're going to concentrate on is disorders of a genetic nature, right? Things that can cause diseases and other problems in humans. We'll start with a discussion of what we call autosomal recessive disorders. Now, autosomal refers to the fact that we're dealing with chromosomes that are not part of the sex chromosomes. So these are genes, or specifically alleles, that are not carried on the X or the Y chromosome. We'll get to those a little bit later on because there are quite a few interesting uh, sex-linked traits. But autosomal traits are found on one of the 22 pairs of somatic chromosomes, the body chromosomes, the non-sex chromosomes. Now, um, if an autosomal disorder is recessive in nature, as we learned in the previous video, that means that you need two copies of this allele in order to be affected by the disorder. Because if you have a dominant allele, then that masks the recessive trait. So the individuals must be homozygous recessive to have the disorder. Now, this diagram on the bottom of the slide illustrates a pedigree, which is essentially a family tree that shows just how some of these traits might be passed on. Um, Now, notice that in generation one, you have a mother who is the circle represents females. The mother is homozygous recessive, and so therefore she is affected by the disorder, whatever it is. The father has at least one copy of the dominant allele, and so therefore there's a good chance that the children in generation two, and this couple has two daughters, and neither one of them is affected by the disorder. That means that they have at least um, the one copy of the dominant allele. They marry two men, and those two men also are unaffected, and their children are unaffected in generation three. However, in generation three, two first cousins actually marry, and notice that that increases the chances that the recessive allele, little a, gets together in generation four. And so we end up with two of the three children there being affected by the disorder. So, some of the characteristics of autosomal recessive disorders are that affected children can have unaffected parents. All right, as you can see, between generations three and four, the uh, parents are not affected, but two of the three children are. Heterozygotes are unaffected. Um, and last but not, well, not last, but two affected parents, meaning two homozygous recessive parents, will always pass that disorder on to their children. Affected individuals with homozygous unaffected mates will have unaffected children, right? Because only one of them is passing the recessive allele on. And as illustrated by generations three and four, close relatives who reproduce are more likely to have affected children. This is one of the dangers of um, uh, marrying your cousins, all right? Because dangerous recessive alleles are more likely to show up in future generations. And because it's autosomal, there is an equal likelihood that males and females will be affected. Now, on the other hand, if the disorder is dominant in nature, that means that individuals who are homozygous dominant and heterozygous will have the disorder. And so it's very likely that this allele will be passed on. In this pedigree, generation one is comprised of two heterozygous individuals. And so, although there is a potential of producing offspring, like the two daughters that are shown here and here, these two daughters are not affected. But the son and the first daughter are affected because they've inherited that dominant allele. The son marries an unaffected woman, but their children are still likely to have the disorder because dad has a 50% chance of passing on that dominant allele. The characteristics of autosomal dominant disorders: affected children usually have affected parents, or at least one affected parent. Heterozygotes, of course, are affected. But if two heterozygous parents reproduce, they can have an unaffected child. Two unaffected parents, however, will never have an affected child because they don't have that dominant gene to pass on. And just like with autosomal recessive disorders, both males and females are affected with equal frequency. Okay, so a couple of genetic disorders of interest, things that you may have heard of. Tay-Sachs disease is a condition that's found mostly in European Jewish populations. It is caused by the lack of an enzyme that breaks down fats, and it results in excess fats and eventually the death of the offspring. Now, this is an autosomal recessive trait. And again, remember, enzymes are proteins, and proteins are produced by DNA. So these alleles are directly connected to the production of the proteins that are needed to break down these things. Cystic fibrosis is also an autosomal recessive trait. In this case, chlorine ions do not pass through cell membranes. And what happens here is that the children tend to build up a thick mucus in their lungs and other organs, and this causes terrible infections. Phenylketonuria, which is abbreviated as PKU. This is caused by the lack of an enzyme. Again, a lack of an enzyme that's required to produce a certain amino acid. And this amino acid is necessary for proper nervous system development. PKU is also autosomal recessive. There is actually warnings on soda cans because soda does contain the byproducts of this, and it can cause PKU. You'll notice if you read the ingredients on a soda can, there's a line that's always in red that talks that is specifically instructed for people with phenylketonuria. Sickle cell disorder is also autosomal recessive. In this case, the red blood cells are sickle-shaped rather than that typical biconcave shape that you usually see. And these cells tend to clog in blood vessels. It results in very painful joints, and it's oftentimes referred to as an anemia because oxygen is not being delivered to the body cells effectively and efficiently. The last one on this list is Huntington disease, and this is caused by when a Huntington protein has too many glutamines on the end of it, and the disease itself leads to the progressive degeneration of brain cells. This one is autosomal dominant, but the difficulty with Huntington disease is that it doesn't present itself until the patient is in his 50s or 60s. And so by that time, typically he's already reproduced or she's already reproduced, and therefore they've already passed this dominant allele on into their children. Okay. Now, a couple of other interesting things about inheritance. As I said early in the first video here, we concentrated mostly on conditions that deal with two alleles, a dominant and a recessive. But there are such things as multiple allele inheritance. And in this case, the gene, whatever it is, exists in several allelic forms. Now, of course, a person can still only carry two of those alleles because you get one allele from mom and one allele from dad. A very good example of this is our blood type. All right, the ABO blood system is governed by three different alleles. The allele for blood type A and the allele for blood type B are both dominant, but they are co-dominant. All right. The recessive allele is what we call the O allele, and it's recessive to both the A and B alleles. So, in order to have a blood type O, you have to have two copies of the recessive allele. Now, blood type O is very, very common, meaning that the recessive allele is far more common in the population than either of the two dominant alleles. Okay, now, the slide here illustrates how you might see blood type being inherited. So in this particular example, we've got a dad here who has blood type B. All right, but notice he's heterozygous. He's got one dominant B allele and one recessive allele. All right, but that makes his blood type B. Mom, on the other hand, Mom, on the other hand, has blood type A. She carries the dominant A allele, but also a recessive allele. So the sperm that dad can produce can either carry the dominant B allele or the recessive allele. The eggs that mom can produce can be either the dominant A or the recessive. And so, what possible offspring can we produce here? Well, in the first box, we have dominant A and dominant B, and this will give us a type AB blood type. In the second box, dad's B and mom's recessive allele give us a heterozygote again, but in this case, that B allele is dominant to the O, and therefore this child will have blood type B. In the third box, we get the recessive allele from dad, but the dominant A allele from mom, and so therefore this child will be blood type A. And finally, this child will have two recessive alleles and therefore be blood type O. So this is simply an example of a set of parents, one of whom is blood type B and one of whom is blood type A, and if they have four children, it's possible for them to produce a child of each of the different blood types: blood type AB, blood type B, blood type A, and blood type O. All right, and so in this case, the phenotypic ratio would be 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. Okay. Now, what if the alleles in question are being carried on the sex chromosomes instead of one of the autosomes? Well, in this case, we're dealing with what we call sex-linked inheritance. Now, these alleles don't have anything to do with your gender, all right, the ones that we're talking about here. These are not the alleles that make you male or female. The sex chromosomes carry other alleles, all right, for other traits, and you'll see that in just a minute. So sex-linked inheritance are simply traits that are controlled by genes that are found on the sex chromosomes. They're not necessarily genes that regard our sex. Now, there's X-linked inheritance, which is when the allele is carried on the X chromosome. And there's Y-linked inheritance, where the allele is carried on the Y chromosome. All right, and so either one of these can happen. However, because the Y chromosome is so small and there aren't a lot of extra genes or alleles carried on that Y chromosome, most sex-linked traits are X-linked, and therefore that's what we'll concentrate on in the next couple of slides. All right. And just for kicks and giggles, sex-linked traits are usually recessive. Okay. So here's an example of an X-linked trait, all right? Color blindness. Color blindness is an allele that is carried on the X chromosome. And so if you carry the dominant allele like this person or this allele here, notice we write X with a capital B as a superscript. This gives you normal vision. On the other hand, if you have an X chromosome with a recessive allele on it, then that is the gene for color blindness. Now, in this particular cross, we're going to cross a normal male with a carrier female. All right. Now, I say the male is normal because his X chromosome, his only X chromosome, carries the dominant allele, and then he has the Y to go along with it. The mother, on the other hand, is what we call a carrier. She is heterozygous. She carries both a copy of the dominant allele and a copy of the recessive allele. The dominant allele masks the recessive allele, and so she has normal vision. Now, what happens when these two reproduce? Well, you can see the results here. In this particular case, and now gender becomes important here. In this case, we're going to have a 4 different possibilities. This offspring is going to be female. All right, she inherits the X chromosome from dad and the another X chromosome from mom, but the one she gets from mom is dominant. All right, and so she carries 2 copies of the dominant allele. Her vision is normal. Okay, this daughter over here gets the dominant allele on the X chromosome from dad, but the recessive allele on the X chromosome from mom. So she is heterozygous, or what we call a carrier, because it's possible we call her a carrier because it's possible for her to give that allele to her offspring. Now, the 2 children that receive the Y from dad can either have normal vision if they get the dominant allele from mom, or they can be colorblind if they receive the recessive allele from mom. All right. So notice none of the daughters are colorblind. All of the females have normal color vision. But for the males, the ratio is 50-50. There's a 50-50 chance that the boy children will be colorblind. All right. And this is a fairly typical inheritance pattern for color blindness. Now, X-linked disorders are more often found in males than in females because the recessive alleles are always expressed. If you only have one X chromosome, as all males do, and you are carrying the recessive allele on that X chromosome, then you're much more likely to have the disorder. Females are less likely because they have 2 copies of the X chromosome, and so it's more common that they would be carriers instead of expressing the trait. Now, most X-linked disorders are recessive, and examples of this include color blindness, which we already talked about, but most often characterized by red-green color blindness. Muscular dystrophy is also an X-linked recessive disorder, and it's characterized by wasting muscles and, unfortunately, death by the age of 20 or so. Finally, on this list, hemophilia. This is characterized by an absence of an enzyme that is called a clotting factor that helps the platelets to clot the blood. But because these folks don't have it, they don't clot their blood very easily, and they tend to bleed out from even very simple wounds. Now, this is a pedigree that illustrates how an X-linked disorder might be passed on. In this case, we have 3 generations, and the grandmother is homozygous dominant, but the grandfather is what we call hemizygous. All right, he only has one X chromosome, and it carries the recessive allele. They pass on their genes to their children. A daughter who is a carrier because she inherits the X-linked recessive allele from her father, and a son who is who's normal. Okay, but the son marries a female who has the condition, meaning she carries 2 of the recessive alleles, and therefore any sons that they produce will be affected by this disorder. In this case, we're talking about color blindness. Now, um, and the grandchildren's generation on the left side from the carrier daughter, even though she married a normal male with normal vision, notice that she still carries that recessive allele and can pass it on to potential grandson or sons in her case. And so you can see that the uh, inheritance pattern is easily discerned from this. Now, in some of the characteristics of X-linked recessive disorders, of course, we already said more males are affected than females. An affected son can have parents who have normal phenotypes, okay? And you can see that in this generation. The grandson here had two unaffected parents. For a female to have the characteristic, her father must also have the uh, characteristic, and her mother either must have it or be a carrier. And the interesting thing is, you may have heard people talking about uh, genetic things that quote unquote skip a generation. All right, they don't really skip a generation, but what happens is that they're found every other generation because the middle generation is a carrier generation, like the left-hand side of this family tree. All right, the grandfather had it and the grandson has it, but the grandson's mother did not, but her father did. And if a woman has the characteristic, all of her sons will definitely have it because sons inherit the X chromosome from their mother. And if mom has two copies of that recessive allele, then Junior is going to get it. Okay. A fascinating case of X-linked disorders is found in the royal family of Europe. And I say the royal family because they're all interrelated from all of the various countries. In this particular case, the trait was first probably discerned in Queen Victoria. And she probably got the allele through either a spontaneous mutation or possibly she was illegitimate. It is possible that her mother, cheated on her father, the king. So maybe this Victoria, not Queen Victoria, but her mother actually either cheated on King Edward or Victoria developed the mutation spontaneously. Anyway, Victoria married Albert, and they had a whole bunch of kids, you can see here, and they had a whole bunch of kids who intermarried and blah, 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 blah. All right, in this line right here, this is Tsar Nicholas II, and I'm not sure who these folks are, but the first cousins in here, the King of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia were all first cousins. So think about that. In World War I, it was really cousins fighting cousins. All right, think about that, getting into a war with your cousins. In any event, this tree goes all the way down to Princes William and Harry. It doesn't go any further than that, but you can see that many of the sons in these three generations here had hemophilia because it's carried by the X chromosome and passed on from mom to son. Now, this allele affected most of the European royal family and may have changed the course of history because heirs would die. The firstborn sons would die of hemophilia. They'd get a small cut or whatever, and they'd bleed out. However, today nobody in the royal family, at least the English royal family, is or carries the allele, and so therefore it's likely been eliminated from the gene pool. All right. It's amazing the number of royals who died in simple accidents, accidents, falling off a horse, things that wouldn't ordinarily kill folks. These folks died of these things. So, anyway, an interesting little story. And there's a great little blurb in your textbook about this. Finally, here is a brief video on Mendelian genetics. So when you're done watching this video, please open up the PowerPoint and click on the hyperlink here to watch this little Mr. Anderson video on Mendelian genetics. So that, my friends, is the end of the second of two videos on genetic inheritance, and I hope you learned something.